Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a slightly late look actually, at the Focal Utopia headphones. And I say a late look because these have been around for quite a long time, and it's been a long time coming for me to get my hands on them. I was able to pick this pair up second hand. I've been really keen to hear them for a long time, and so I can now finally share my thoughts, both in terms of how they are on their own in isolation as a headphone, but also how they compare to other headphones like the Focal Clear, the HD800S, so whether or not they're worth the upgrade from either of those options, and also how they compare given the similar pricing to my favourite headphones, the Meza Empyreans. So come along now as I explore the question of whether the Focal Utopias are still one of the very best, or maybe even the very best headphone on the market. At $4,000 US, the Utopias are an extremely expensive headphone. There's very few headphones at this end of the market, and so in that regard, they're in fairly rare air. At the same time, you need to be able to justify a price tag like that, and the Focal Utopias aim to do that in a number of ways. First and foremost, they use a beryllium driver, and beryllium is a fairly rare metal, and one that you don't find in a huge number of audio applications. It's popped up here and there, including in some lower end IEMs, but in the case of the Utopias, it's also paired with Focal's M-shaped diaphragm design. Now what that means is that the diaphragm itself is shaped with a series of kinks that essentially resemble the shape of an M, and with those kinks and angles in the dome, the idea is that the combination of the beryllium, which is a very light but very rigid metal, the combination of that plus the shape of the dome should make for an extremely lightweight but very rigid driver. The result of that is a very clean motion of the driver, and in theory a driver that will stop and start very, very accurately. That should all translate to a very pure sound and a very responsive sound as well. I'll talk shortly about how the sound quality comes across, but before we do, let's talk a little bit more about the design and the features of the Utopias. First and foremost, that dome that I just spoke about is attached to a voice coil that produces an 80 ohm impedance, which is not crazy high. It's a little bit higher than average, but nothing too scary. At the same time, the Utopias have a sensitivity of 104 decibels, making them very easy to drive. There's not very many devices on the planet that won't get a decent volume level out of these. That said, you'd be crazy to pair a $4,000 US headphone with anything less than top-end equipment. And that's because you're going to want to hear the maximum of what they can do, and not doing so would be kind of like buying a Ferrari and just driving it backwards and forwards to the shops. It's going to do the job, but it's probably not ideal and a bit of a waste of their potential. In addition to the high-tech driver, the Utopias are also beautifully put together. They've got this beautiful leather headband, they've got the same sort of structure as the Focal Clears that I've also reviewed here on the channel, where there's a nice solid clicky, notchy adjustment, and that means the headphones stay exactly how you set them up. The yokes themselves are made of carbon fibre, they feel beautiful, and of course they're very, very light as a result. And then the cups themselves are a combination of metal, but also a little bit of high quality plastic. Now I have to admit I was a bit disappointed to find plastic on a headphone of this level, but it is a high quality plastic, and so that somewhat improves the experience of interacting with it, but it would have been nice to see metal used all throughout the headphone, and obviously some padding and some leather here for the softer bits that touch your head. The pads that connect with your head are also a high quality leather, and in this case they're a fenestrated leather, so that's going to improve breathability but also may change the sound tonality, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Not that I have any other pads to try on these, but just to talk about how the overall sound is. What I can say from everything I've shared so far is that these are a very comfortable headphone. Some people have an issue with the fact that they creak a little bit when being moved around, but they feel very, very high quality in terms of manufacture, and I don't get the sense there's going to be any issues with the structure of these having any long-term durability issues. The final thing I should mention about the design is on the bottom of each cup, we've got these special bayonet connectors. Now these are a LEMO connector. It's not proprietary to Focal, but it is a slightly unique plug. You don't see a lot of them around. What I like about these though is that they're very easy to attach and detach when you need to from the headphones. They lock securely, but they come out easily. The reason I'm highlighting that is that with the HD800S over here, these use a proprietary Sennheiser connector that I absolutely loathe. And the reason for that is when you go to remove these from the headphones, they come out with a real, like they take a lot of pressure, so when they give, they come out with a real fly and a flurry. And I've had in the past with my original HD800s, not the S version here, I had a problem where, despite being really, really careful, as I removed the plug one day, it flicked a little bit and caught the edge of the headphone. That resulted in a scratch to the paint and therefore devalued the headphone and just cosmetically didn't look as good. So I really appreciate the fact that with the choice of the LEMO connectors on the Focal Utopias, they're very easy to remove and pose no risk to doing any damage to the cable or the headphone themselves. Speaking of the cable, the stock cable with the Utopias, some people have complained about. It's a quite heavy cable, as you can probably see here, and you'll definitely have seen in the Glamour video. It's a thick figure-8 style cable with big heavy connectors on the end, and overall is quite, I guess, utilitarian in some ways. It's not a lightweight, luxurious feeling cable, but what I do find is it's a very high quality and durable feeling cable, and honestly I prefer that. I do find I need to set myself up in just the right way with the cable running down the center rather than off to the side, because otherwise I do notice its weight if I turn it all in my chair. Once I'm set up though with the cable running straight down, I find it extremely comfortable to wear and no issues. I think it also sounds fantastic. Now that might be an unusual thing to say about a stock cable, but when I picked up the Utopias second hand, they came with an Aurealis cable, which is this one here. Now I'm a huge fan of Aurealis cables. I've bought his cables for my Mesa Empyreans that are over here, and I'll talk about those shortly. But in the case of this one, I just felt like it actually detracted from the sound of the Utopias rather than adding to it. And I think that's because it's a multi-wire blend. It's a combination of copper and either silver-plated copper or pure silver, and I actually find the stock cable to sound more pure and clean than this aftermarket from Aurealis, which is great quality in terms of its manufacture, but just doesn't sound as good. So we've got a fantastic quality cable, albeit a heavy one. We've got a beautifully designed headphone that's comfortable. It looks amazing. It feels amazing. All of the pieces so far add up to what should be a fantastic experience, assuming that it sounds good. So let's have a chat now about the sound. In isolation, just thinking about the Utopias by themselves, they're a wonderful sounding headphone. They're incredibly smooth, incredibly resolving, and overall have a very good tonal balance. I do wish they had just a touch more bass at times, and as you'll see from the frequency response chart, they do roll off a little bit down the bottom, and that's probably a part of the problem for me. But it's a very, very minor issue, and they're much better for me at least in terms of engaging me with the music than something like the HD800S, despite having relatively similar sound signatures. As I'll talk about in a moment, the quality that comes from the Utopia is less about its sound signature and its tuning, and much more about the capabilities of its driver. And the reason I say that is from comparison with 3 other headphones with relatively similar sound signatures, the Utopia consistently delivers an incredibly smooth and yet resolving and detailed presentation that can only be a result of the way its driver is performing. But I'll get to that shortly. For now, I just want to talk a little bit more about what I think is the absolute strength of the Utopia, and that's its soundstage and imaging. The Utopia produces this incredibly perfect sphere of sound. So unlike a lot of headphones where it might stretch more to the sides, the Utopia does a beautiful job at producing a perfect sphere, assuming that's what the recording has, of course, but my point being, it's able to render the soundstage correctly and accurately across all sorts of recordings. Within that soundstage, each individual sound is also beautifully and precisely placed. So you're listening to various tracks, you can hear all the individual instruments, but in a very coherent way within a very coherent soundstage. An interesting example I was listening to while I was doing my testing and note-taking for these was Bleeding Heart by Jimi Hendrix. Now this is off the People, Hell and Angels album, which came out after Jimmy's death, a long time after its actually relatively recent release. And I'm thinking now, having listened to it with the Utopias, there must have been some kind of mashing together of sounds. Because when I listened to it with the Utopias, it was the first time I'd really noticed that the sound of Jimmy's guitar and vocals is really centralised and holographic, but then the rest of the band is a little bit ethereal off in the background. And it makes me wonder if they've taken Jimmy's recordings and somehow mashed them together with other backing recordings, whether they were done later, done separately, perhaps they were demos that they've tried to remaster into a finished product. I'm not quite sure, but the Utopias gave me that level of insight that I could tell that something was a bit different in the way it had all been pieced together. Of course, it could have just been an artistic decision by the producers and the mastering engineers. I'm not sure what the story is behind it, but the Utopias showed to me that there were differences in the way the individual pieces of the recordings have been put together. And that tells you a bit about what the Utopias are great for. They're an incredible headphone at pulling apart the music in a way that's still enjoyable and engaging, but allows you to hear everything going on. When I jumped over and listened to the Mesa Empyreans on that same track though, what I found was that the Mesa Empyreans brought me more into an engagement with the track, whilst losing out just a little bit on some of the resolution and detail and insight. And I'll talk about that more in a moment once I go through my comparisons. For now though, what I want to tell you is that the Utopias are one of the best, if not the best headphone I've ever heard in terms of resolution, detail retrieval, and overall soundstage creation. The one knock I have against them is they do lack a little bit of bass and therefore just a touch of engagement for me that prevents me from being fully immersed in the sound. One thing I should mention before I go into the comparisons is that the Utopias perform really nicely with high output impedance amps. That's one of the reasons I've got them sitting here on the Aurus Audio Utop, because it is a tube amp that happens to have a high output impedance mode. With that setting, or the same sort of setting on my bottlehead mainline under the desk behind me here, the Utopias come alive a little bit in terms of engagement. Putting them with a high output impedance means you get a little bit more bass response from them and a slightly looser delivery, but it's very, very slight. So whilst you're trading off a tiny little bit of resolution, you're gaining a bit of warmth and a bit of engagement. And that's something I really enjoy about the Utopias, is they give me the ability to almost have two headphones in one. If I connect them to the Utop or to the mainline, I can jump between a relatively neutral, maybe slightly leaner than neutral headphone that's incredibly resolving and revealing, or with the flick of a switch, I can get something a little bit warmer, a little bit more engaging, and still incredibly resolving. So I thoroughly enjoy that about the Utopias. I'm going to talk shortly about my specific comparisons with the HD800S, but while we're talking high output impedance headphone amps, that's been something I've often done with the HD800S, is connected up to the mainline or the Utop and switch to high output impedance mode. And I can tell you that whilst that also improves the HD800S slightly, it doesn't do as much good for the HD800S as it does for the Utopia. And I'd put that down to the fact that the Utopia starts with a lower impedance and therefore is going to be more affected by that high output impedance. Purists out there watching this video might think that it's blasphemy to connect a relatively, moderate impedance headphone to a high output impedance amplifier, and in some ways you could say that's true. But the reality is, listening to music should be all about enjoyment. And for me, I definitely find the Utopias are a more enjoyable headphone with high output impedance, but they're a more accurate headphone with the lower output impedance. So it's really great that you can switch between the two. The HD800S, not quite so much. To a lesser degree, they do still do that, but just not to the degree that I enjoy in the Utopias. Enjoying this video? If you are and you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, there are lots of ways you can help, and most of them don't cost you a cent. You can help for free by liking this video, subscribing and ringing the bell, sharing this video on social media or your favourite audio forums, or by making your next purchases using any of the affiliate links in the description. Obviously that's not technically free, but you're not spending anything extra and it all helps out. Want to go a step further? You could buy some merchandise, t-shirt, hoodies, caps and the like, or you can join the Passion for Sound family on Patreon. It's a growing community with plenty of interesting discussion and your chance to influence what happens on the channel. Check out the description for more information and links where relevant. But for now, let's get back to the video. So now let's talk about some comparisons. My first comparison for the Focal Utopias was their baby brother Focal Clear. I reviewed these on the channel some time ago. They're a wonderful headphone, and in their price range I still think they're very, very hard to beat for their combination of enjoyment, engagement, but still accuracy and resolution. You can see very, very similar design cues compared to the Utopia. We've got the same general headband and yoke system, although these are metal. You've also got the metal grills here in a very similar way to the Utopias. So a lot of the design cues and indeed the technologies on the inside are the same as the Utopia. So with that in mind, I was really curious to see a couple of things. First of all, how the tuning differed between these, and also what the listening experience was like. I was particularly curious to see if I felt the need to keep the Utopias with already owning the Clears, or if I felt that they both had their own place in my collection. And what I can tell you is that the Utopias are almost identical to the Clears, but doing everything better. As you'll see from the graphs I'm going to put on screen, their frequency responses are very, very similar. And as I listened to both of them, what I found was that the overall presentation of both was also quite similar. But in the case of the Clears here, they put a slightly different kind of timbral quality or characteristic to the sound, and that's really what separates the two. The Clears are slightly more forceful in the upper mids, or that sort of presence area, and that results in a slightly edgier, slightly sharper sound at times. And that's been my one knock of the Focal Clears since day one, is every now and again they can just get a tiny little bit edgy, or a tiny bit metallic even. I don't find any of that at all from the Utopias, and so I'm putting that down to the differences in the drivers. As part of my testing, I applied a SonarWorks calibration curve to both of these to essentially render them as a dead flat responding headphone. And in doing that, what I found was that both headphones sounded very, very similar in terms of signature, but you could still tell the refinement and the smoothness in the Utopia's delivery, because it's not about the frequency response only, it's also about the characteristics of how the driver starts and stops and responds to the signal coming from the amplifier. One of the test tracks I used when comparing these was The Boy Had Trouble by Bobby Flynn. Now, I haven't got album art for this one. It's a slightly obscure album from an independent Australian artist who I think might be on Apple iTunes, but is not on Tidal from my checking on there. So if you do have a chance to check it out, The Boy Had Trouble is a great track from a really interesting artist from here in Australia. But the key thing here is that in that track, listening to these two headphones, it was really, really clear the difference between the two. What I found was the Focal Clears was still a little bit edgy on the delivery, whereas listening to the Utopias, things like the recording of the drums in The Boy Had Trouble were absolutely tonally perfect. It was like sitting in the room with the drums in terms of the tonal accuracy from the snare, from the cymbals. The whole drum kit sounded spot on to real life. So ultimately what I'd say is that both of these headphones are absolutely brilliant headphones. The Clears for their price are still one of the best options on the market. But if you're in a position where you can afford to go to the Utopias, I'd say it's absolutely a noticeable upgrade. I'm not going to try and say whether it's a worthwhile upgrade, because you're spending an extra, $2,000 odd US, if I'm recalling the numbers correctly. You're spending a significant amount more to go from the Clears to the Utopias. Whether that's worth it is really up to you. What I can say is that the difference is noticeable and significant in my opinion. I am certainly going to be keeping the Utopias, and I may or may not sell the Clears. If I keep them, it's purely because I think they're a great reference point for my other reviews. I don't see any need to have them in my collection from a listening point of view, because I would always reach for the Utopias before the Clears. So with that comparison done, the next obvious comparison for me was the HD800S. The HD800S are a wonderful revision on the original HD800s, which I owned for a long time, never particularly liked. The HD800S did win me over a little bit more as I got used to it and got to kind of respect what it was doing, but they've never been a go-to headphone for me. They've been a listening tool and very much an analytical device for me, not something I reach to for enjoyment. And ultimately for me, headphones are about enjoyment. These have only lived in my collection as a comparison tool and a testing tool for equipment. So with that in mind, I was curious to see how these two compared, both in terms of frequency response once again, but also in terms of the listening experience. I can imagine there'll be people on the market with the HD800S that think, is it worth going up to something like the Utopia? And again, to shortcut the answer, I'd say yes, I think it's a noticeable and significant upgrade. I'm not going to say whether it's worth it in terms of a dollar sense. That's going to be up to you. What might surprise you though is looking at their frequency responses side by side. As you'll see on screen here, the Sennheiser HD800S actually has a little bit more bass in a few pockets of the bass response. Overall, the Utopia is a little bit smoother, and that results in a smoother overall presentation and a more neutral overall sound, but the HD800S on certain tracks did actually come across slightly punchier or slightly fuller, but it was very much track dependent. What really separates these two for me is the way they present the sound, and in two areas. One of them is that the soundstage presentation is quite different. The HD800S throws a larger soundstage that's probably a little bit wider and not quite as deep as the Utopia, but in the process of doing so is slightly less coherent at times. Things get a little bit too separated in some situations with the HD800S. Now sometimes that can be really enjoyable because it draws your attention to individual sounds and can be quite an exciting process to hear all the different sounds and where they sit. If you're looking for the more lifelike experience though, I think that's where the Utopias win out. The other thing that separates these two for me is that the delivery of the upper registers from the Sennheisers for me is a little bit brittle sounding. It's got just a thinness to it that I don't entirely know where it comes from. It might be a touch of distortion coming through. It might just be the characteristics of the driver and how it produces the leading edge of the notes. So when it's pushing forwards, how it's moving in the air, I'm not entirely sure. But what I do know is that side by side, the two are incredibly revealing, very, very neutral sounding with possibly a touch towards that leaner side of neutral. But in the case of the Utopias, they're smooth whilst being incredibly resolving. Whereas I find the HD800S to be just a little bit sharp or a little bit kind of, as I said before, brittle with its upper register sounds. Once again, I think both headphones are fantastic, but I just think the tonal quality of the Utopia, the way it maintains that smoothness and refinement while still being incredibly close to neutral, I think that's to me what makes the Utopia the better headphone. I was going to say worth the extra money, but I really can't say that because that's your decision. I think though it is the better headphone sonically and technically speaking. Once again with this test, I applied a SonarWorks calibration curve, and once again what I found was that whilst both headphones remained very similar in terms of their sound signature, the characteristics and the presentation of the sound was still a bit brittle on the Sennheisers and still beautifully smooth from the Utopias. So realistically, what I think you're paying for with something like the Utopias here, you're paying for the driver technologies and the resulting refinement and smoothness in the way it can then deliver the sound. Whether that's worth it to you, I'm going to leave for you to think about and decide for yourself. For now though, I want to talk about a headphone that's a direct competitor to the Utopia in terms of price. The Meze Empyreans here have been my go-to favourite headphone ever since I first reviewed them. I just love the way they present music. I love the fact that they're warm, they're rich, they're also still very resolving and very detailed, but they never push any of it in your face. And in many ways, I see these two as almost exact opposites to one another, but in a very, very good way. Now for this testing, I should mention, I've put the velour pads on the Empyreans, which are not normally my choice of pads. I love the leather pads on the Empyreans because I like the fact that they're lush and rich and engaging. That's why I lean towards these headphones as my favourite headphone in my collection. But for the sake of this comparison, I wanted to bring them a bit closer together. And so I put on the velours, and what I found was, as I said, they're almost a direct opposite of each other. If an absolutely dead neutral, perfect rendition of sound was right here in the middle, the Utopias sit just this side in terms of being a little bit lean in the presentation, and the Empyreans with the velours to me sit just this side in terms of being a little bit warm. If you look at the graph that I've got on screen, you'll notice that the Empyreans pull the treble back a little bit, but otherwise are very, very linear in the bass. The Utopias roll off a little bit earlier in the bass, and they have the slightly higher treble. So somewhere in between those two, I think would be an absolutely dead neutral perfect headphone. But as it is, both of these are wonderful in their own way, they just have different characteristics. And what I mean by that is that the Utopias are a headphone with amazing resolution, amazing detail, and an impeccable soundstage that's not necessarily the most engaging headphone, but you can engage in it if you want to. So what I mean by that is the Utopias are going to draw your attention to the details in the music first, and then you've kind of got to get past those to then relax into the music. In the case of the Empyreans, they're going to have you relaxing into the music first, but if you choose to look for the details are all there. So it depends on what your first choice is. Do you want details first and engagement second? Or do you want engagement first and details second? That's where these two headphones are a wonderful complement for each other, in my opinion. A couple of things that do separate them pretty cleanly is that the Utopias do soundstage better. They're a much more spacious and spherical style soundstage, whereas the Empyreans, whilst they produce a wonderful image, don't have the sense of space and depth that the Utopias can produce. Both of them are top-level headphones without a doubt in my mind, but they just do things a little bit differently. One thing that's really nice about the Empyreans is that given they come with both sets of pads, you can tune the sound a little bit by changing the pads over. I guess similarly though, I've already talked about the fact that if you've got a switchable output impedance amplifier, you can kind of do the same thing with the Utopias. They never quite reach the engaging and exciting highs of the Empyreans for me, but they do get a bit more engaging with that high output impedance. And likewise, the Empyreans are never going to be the pure analytical tool that the Utopias can be. One final thing that separates these, which I've kind of skipped back and forth from, is that the bass from the Empyreans is pretty peerless. It's so flat and so level all the way down to the bottom registers that it's a really exciting and enjoyable listening experience. And that's whether or not you've got the velour pads, which bring things a bit more into balance, or whether you go all out and use the leather pads, which pull back on the treble a little bit more, or boost the bass a bit more depending on how you look at it. So in both cases, you've got two headphones which absolutely excel at what they do, and it's going to come down to your personal preference which one is right for you. If I could only choose one of these, I would still choose them as Empyreans because I love their overall presentation, and as I said before, the headphones for me are about enjoyment first, analytics second. That's why the Empyreans would win, but if somebody said to me the Utopias are the only one you could have, I would not for a second be upset because they're wonderful, wonderful headphones. And in fact, I'm probably going to end up selling both my Clears and my HD800S. I'm still deciding on the Clears because of what I said before about them being a great reference headphone, but definitely the HD800S are going because I just think the Utopias do everything better except massive soundstage size. So ultimately for me, as you've probably gathered by this stage, I think the Utopias absolutely still deserve their place as one of the best headphones on the market. I'm not going to say they're the best headphone on the market because so much of this comes down to personal preference, and there's so many headphones I haven't yet heard, particularly at this super top end. What I can tell you though is if you're looking for a headphone that is, I think, got to be pretty close to the last word in refinement and purity and almost neutrality, being a little bit leaner than neutral, the Utopia should absolutely be on your list. I still don't think you should overlook other headphones on the market, like the Empyreans and some of the offerings from Hi-Fi-Man, the headphones I've heard good things about, the Abyss headphones I've heard good things about. As I said, there's lots of them I haven't yet tried, but the Utopias are absolutely worth their place within that discussion, as are the Empyreans here. So hopefully that's helped clarify for you if it's worth saving up for these, trying to audition them, checking these out, checking the Empyreans out, maybe looking to upgrade from the Clears or the HD800S. Hopefully I've provided a bit of clarity for you. If I have, and if you enjoyed the review, have a think about subscribing and hitting the like button. Don't forget I haven't yet drawn the giveaways for the Shanling UP4 and the UA1. If you're interested in winning either or both of those, make sure you check out the video reviews on the AG400i and the Shit Jotunheim 2. I'll put links down below so you can go and check those out. For now though, I'll leave you to the music. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.